Hello to everyone, and thank you, Dirk, for introducing me and inviting me to give this talk. Actually, I'm very pleased to be part of this extraordinary lecture series, and I'm very excited to be able to give this talk here. The title of my talk is Adaptation to Other Speech Evidence from Patients with Neurological Conditions. And here's my disclosure and the ethics. And I will start with sound change, which is an important topic in linguistics, but quite unusual in our field. Sound change is about the change of the sound patterns of languages over many, many years, over centuries. Here's an example from German. The word reiten, to ride in English, has been written many centuries ago, then become written until it became written today. So this sounds historical and ancient, but it is actually the fossilization of subtle ongoing changes that can be observed over a shorter period as well. For instance, over decades, like in this paper by Jonathan Harrington and co-workers about the Queen of England and the vowel articulation of the Queen of England and how it changed over 3 decades. And they say that there was a drift in the Queen's accent towards one that is characteristic of speakers who are younger and or lower in the social, I don't see this, in the social hierarchy. And even shorter terms like over months. For instance, this one article also by Jonathan Harrington, who is the head of the department that hosts our group, about phonetic change in a group of researchers, and during an Antarctic winter where they were separated. And they described that these researchers, these people were found to develop the first stages of common accent. So there was change also in their vowel articulation. And then even shorter time slots, time frames over minutes. This was a study of a Belgian group studying 2 Belgian speakers of French who were exposed to speech of a different dialect, a different radiolect, and were found to adapt to the speech of the different dialect. So these observations are framed in exemplar theory, which states that each exemplar of a speech event leaves a trace in episodic memory, and that phonological categories are represented by clouds of such exemplars in perceptual space. So the driving force of these adaptive changes is interactive language use. So there is covert imitation of fine phonetic details in conversational interactions all the time. And phonetic convergence means adaptation in vocal pitch, vowel quality, voice onset time, articulation rate, speech rhythm, and so on and so forth. And what this tells us is that there is a constant interplay of auditory, perceptual, and motor processes of speech, and a lifelong plasticity of auditory and also motor speech targets. The terminology that is used in this field is varies and is sometimes inconsistent. We have terms like adaptation, interactive accommodation, or speech entrainment. But what is important is that there are basically 2 different classes of paradigms. One termed phonetic convergence, the imitation of fine phonetic detail that I was talking about, and which ultimately leads to sound change. And these paradigms have attracted no or only little attention in clinical science and neuroscience so far. And more attention has been attributed to a paradigm termed temporal alignment, which takes place, for instance, in conversations and during turn-taking or in synchronized speech. And there is this one, or probably the first study by Stephens and co-workers describing the temporal spatial coupling of brain activities in a speaker and the listeners listening to a story that is presented by the speaker. So there's coupling in the brain between speakers and listeners during these conversational interactions. The most prominent paradigm for temporal alignment is turn-taking, which is interesting because it takes only very few seconds, milliseconds, between 0 and 400 milliseconds for, as a change between two speakers. This is from a study by Castellucci and others who examined such dyads, interactions, and they were interested in the time in between the listener and the speaker and the listener. The theory is that these short times interval an overlap between speech planning and the perception of the ongoing speech. And in this study, this was an ECOG study of 8 patient volunteers with many, many electrodes, and they found that the caudal portions of the inferior frontal and medial frontal gyrus are involved in this planning activity. Another temporal alignment paradigm is synchronous speech or choral speaking, joint speech. This has been used as a therapeutic intervention many times in apraxia of speech, non-fluent aphasia, or even developmental stuttering. The Friedrichsen group has published a series of papers on this paradigm. They call it speech entrainment, and they examined aphasic patients who underwent speech entrainment in the online mimicking of an audiovisual speech model, as they called it. And this is from one of their studies where they did a voxel-based lesion symptom mapping of like 40 aphasic patients, I think. And they found that the patients who profited most from the speech entrainment regarding their fluency, improvement of their fluency, were patients who had lesions in these anterior parts of the language cortex, which they found responsible for facilitation during speech entrainment. Here's a short overview of the next 30 minutes. I will talk about speech adaptation in interactive contexts in different clinical populations. And I have 3 parts here. The first part is about phonetic convergence in patients with left and right hemispheric stroke. The second is about temporal alignment in patients with post-stroke aphasia and Parkinson's disease. And the last part is on subcortical dysfunctions in Parkinson's and cerebral disorders, on adaptation to others' speech rate and speech rhythm. This first project is a long time ago. The first paper was in 2009. It was in collaboration with Annette Baumgärtner, who was then in Hamburg, and there were 2 PhD students who did all the work here, Juliane Kappes and Claudia Peschke. And I will focus in my discussion on the second of these papers. And this project included here 2 groups of patients with medial cerebral artery infarctions, 10 patients with aphasia after left hemisphere infarction, and 11 patients with right hemisphere infarctions. And notably, the right hemisphere lesions were much larger than the left hemisphere lesions. lesions in these two groups. The first paradigm we used in this study was, we call it segmental paradigm, was about the imitation of variation in articulation style. We distinguish between two ends of hyper and hypo articulation. In German, this can be done in Schwarz-Silber reduction, which occurs very often. Here's an example. The word Tauben, pigeons, for instance, can be produced in everyday speech in a hyperarticulated version as Tauben, and in an extremely hypoarticulated version like Tauben, with reduction of the schwa vowel and assimilation of the consonant. So this is used to signal new versus given information, formal versus informal speech, emphasis, stance, clarity, and so on. And it has no phonological function in German. So the research question here would be, in an experiment like word repetition, would a participant automatically imitate the degree of Schwarz-Silber reduction of a model speaker? And we used 48 stimuli, different stimuli, pseudo words with a plural article, die, for instance, die Deigel, die Kauben, etc., which resembles article noun phrases, which are very frequent in German, and they were spoken by a professional speaker in two different Schwarz-Silber variants per stimulus, one more reduced and one more explicit. And we had, for the analysis, we had perceptual ratings by 30 phonetic students who rated these stimuli on a scale from 0 hypoarticulated to 3 hyperarticulated. And the second paradigm in this study was a prosodic paradigm. We looked at the same utterances and we looked at the pitch pattern here. These utterances have an accent on the second syllable, so the F0 is usually raised on the second syllable. And we looked at the amount of pitch elevation, the pitch elevation magnitude of the model speaker on the second syllable. And here we used the model speaker's natural variation. He was not aware of the use of this parameter. We had two experimental conditions. One is a standard repetition. So after a delay of 800 milliseconds, the participant repeated the stimulus presented by the model speaker. And we had a transformation task, which was more complex. So when the stimulus was hypoarticulated, the participant had to respond with a hyperarticulated response, and vice versa. So we did a short implicit learning trial beforehand, and then after that, the experiment. So the research question here was, would participants automatically adapt to the degree of Schwarz-Silber reduction in the repetition task? And would they also adapt to the magnitude of pitch elevation in this repetition task, but also in the transformation task, where the words had to be transformed to a different form? And this is the results of the non-word repetition task. And we have a group analysis by item here. So each dot here is one of these 48 items. And this is about articulation style. So the rating scale from 0 to 3 for the model speaker and for the responses by the participants. And we see here that these hyper continuum was fairly dichotomous. So we had mostly reduced and mostly very explicit stimuli. But the normal controls here adapted to that, and they responded by reproducing approximately the articulation style of the model. And the same was true in the right hemisphere patients. to the same degree almost, and to a lesser degree for the left hemisphere patients. And this is the pitch elevation, again in the non-word repetition task. And we see a modulation of the pitch elevation by until 6 semitones in the model speaker. And the participants responded by varying between 0 and 4 semitones. And there was a fairly high correlation in the normal controls and in the right hemisphere patients, and less so in the left hemisphere patients. Then here, transformation. So this is the task where participants had to respond in a reverse way. So the reduced stimuli had to be responded by a more explicit style and vice versa. And here is how the participants fared on this task. So they did quite well, the normal controls and the right hemisphere patients did quite well, whereas the left hemisphere patients had large overlap here, but they also responded in a way to this task. And now more interesting, the pitch elevation in this particular task, where a different response had to be given. And we see here that the pitch elevation imitation was much weaker than in the response repetition condition in the normal controls and the right hemisphere patients, but was still there and significant, but no longer significant in the left hemisphere patients. So I recall that these patients had lesions all over the left hemisphere. There were anterior and posterior lesions in these patients. So what we did then was a voxel-based lesion symptom mapping of the left hemisphere group, and using MRI-Crew. And we first looked at a correlation of the lesion site with phonemic accuracy. So the phonemic errors in repetition, in word repetition. And we found this, region here centered in Heschel's gyrus and extending posteriorly to superior temporal gyrus and superior supramarginal gyrus. For the adaptation of articulation style, the reduction, we see a correlation here, very small area, in the medial aspect of Heschel's gyrus. And similarly, the adaptation of prosodic detail associated with lesions, also in Heschel's gyrus, but more laterally. So to summarize, there was adaptation to a natural variation of schwa syllable expression, the articulation style, and a natural variation of pitch elevation on stressed syllables. The prosodic detail was present in neurotypical speakers, in patients with very large lesions to the right cerebral hemisphere, and also in patients with lesions to anterior language areas of the left hemisphere. But adaptation was absent, or at least diminished, in patients with left superior temporal lesions. So that we can infer that left auditory cortex has a leading role in adaptation to fine phonetic detail. This is the second part of the talk. It's about temporal alignment. And this was a study done by Ingrid Eichert in collaboration with Simone Falk from Montreal and Andres Servais-Baumann from Munich. And there were 2 papers on this study, and I will focus on the second of these 2 papers. And the study used a sequential synchronization paradigm, which I will explain in a minute. The research question was, do patients with post-stroke speech impairment, either apraxic or phonological impairment spontaneously align with another speaker's speech rhythm. And this is interesting given what we have seen before, the preserved propensity for phonetic convergence in apraxia of speech and the diminished propensity for convergence in phonological impairment. And the same research question then for patients with Parkinson's disease. And patients with Parkinson's disease are known to be responsive to all kinds of external stimuli, rhythmical stimuli, but so far not of natural speech stimuli. This is the sequential synchronization paradigm. Participants were presented a model, sentence model like here, Mona testet erstmals diese Geige, spoken by a male model speaker here. And after that, after a short pause, the same sentence was presented by a female speaker. And in this sentence, we spliced out the last word, the target word, and invited the participants to produce the target word smoothly together with the prime sentence. And the analysis was focused on the speech onset delay relative to the onset of the last metrical foot of the prime sentence. And we used the average foot duration of the prime sentences as a like a frame for the timing of the participants' response. We had two different types of prime sentences, regular ones and irregular ones. The regular ones were sequences of stressed, unstressed syllables all along. The irregular sentences were like Mira betrog zunächst diesen Tenor, sounded more irregular. They had more complex metrical feet, and they also had a stress clash in the middle of the sentence. And then we had two different target word types. One, a regular one with a stressed first syllable and unstressed second, and the reverse, an iambic shape, unstressed syllable in the first position and stressed in the second. So there was a orthogonal design here, and we had 4 groups: 12 patients with apraxia of speech, 12 patients with phonological impairment and no apraxia of speech, and 12 patients with dysarthria after Parkinson's disease. We had 24 control speakers. And this is the response pattern of the controls. The green line here demarcates the average foot duration of the prime sentence, so the rhythmical frame of the prime sentence. And what we see here is that in the regular condition, that is the regular prime sentence completed with a regular target word, the control participants responded largely in rhythm with a model. That is, they reacted very closely to the time pattern of the model speaker's prime sentence. To the contrary, when the prime sentence had an irregular rhythm, they responded earlier, and we thought that this was more, they were more in a reaction time mode. They did not keep to the timing of the prime sentence, but responded as early as they could, or at least even earlier than in this condition. And in the condition with the iambic target words, we saw a consistent delay, which is consistent with what we found earlier several times in our studies, namely that the phonetic planning of iambic words is much different, in German at least, from the phonetic planning of trochaic words, which are more frequent in German. So for this analysis, we then normalized the responses to the average foot duration, which is 0 here, and we see the pattern here of the control speakers. And this is the full pattern for all 4 groups. We had a significant group effect. There was a massively increased delay in the aphasic populations, and we saw a significant target effect. So the target delay was greater in the iambic words than in the trochaic words. And looking only at the controls in the Parkinson's patients, we see only a slight increase in response times in Parkinson's disease, but there was no significant effect and no interaction with group in this analysis. And looking at the 2 aphasic groups, we see this prominent effect of target word, of the disadvantage of the iambic words, but no significant effect of group. That is, the groups were statistically the same, and there was also no interaction with group. And more importantly, perhaps, there was also no interaction with prime. That is, their responses were had the same delays in response to irregular as to regular prime sentences. So, wrapping this up, there was adaptation to the speech rhythm of the model in the neurotypical speakers and also in patients with Parkinson's disease, but not in patients with post-stroke aphasia, irrespective of whether they had apraxia of speech or not. However, in the study that I had mentioned, the earlier study, on the same group, on these same groups, we saw that apraxic speakers and patients with phonological impairment made significantly more segmental errors on target words after irregular primes. That is, they were obviously still sensitive to the perceived speech rhythm, though they could not employ this, they could not benefit from this in the timing of their reactions. So the patients with post-stroke aphasia, with or without apraxia of speech, were sensitive to the perceived speech rhythm of the model in terms of their speech errors, but they were unable to align their responses in time with the model, probably due to the speech planning and initiation problems these patients may have. And in the Parkinson's patients, they replicated the response pattern of the neurotypical speakers in that they picked up the model speaker's regular rhythm, but not the irregular speech rhythm. And they had a delay when the perceived model and the produced target word were rhythmically incompatible. So this is the final part of the talk. It's about the role of subcortical structures, basal ganglia and cerebellum in adaptation to others' speech rate and rhythm. So this is again about adaptation, not temporal alignment. And this was the PhD thesis by Mona Speth, and Ingrid Eichert was also involved, and the study was done together with Dagmar Tillmann-Braun, who is an expert in cerebellar disorders, and Andres Servas-Baumann, who is an expert in Parkinson's disease. The study has not been submitted so far. Hopefully next week we will submit it. And we focused on the basal ganglia because basal ganglia are known to be involved in auditory temporal processing and in beat perception. And they are known to contribute to motor rhythm and motor timing. There are lots of papers on this in the literature. and the cerebellum as a second part, which is known as a perceptual organ, including auditory perception, which is implicated in perceptual motor adaptation of all kinds, in rhythm production and timing of movement. So we had 3 groups again. We had 15 Parkinson's patients. We had 12 patients with spinocerebellar ataxia type 6, which is an acknowledged model of cerebellar impairment. And we had 27 neurotypical controls. And notably, there was no difference between the 2 clinical groups in the degree of their cognitive impairment. They had no or at most mild dementia. And also in their dysarthria, they had moderate to mild dysarthria, but there was no difference in the severity between the 2 groups. And we also did a rate discrimination task with them. And there was no difference between the 3 groups in the perceptual and auditory distinction between different speech rates. The materials were very similar to the last paradigm, 48 sentences spoken by a professional speaker, and we again had 2 different rhythm types, one regular, Mara, Haste, manchmal dieses Yoga, and one irregular, Sonja, Betrieb, Effekt, dieses Labor. And we had 3 conditions, a reading condition, reading aloud after short familiarization. So participants saw the sentence on the screen and made themselves familiar with it and then produced it. And the second was a repetition condition. They were made familiar with the sentence again, then the sentence was produced by the model speaker and they repeated it. And the third one was a turn-taking condition, so we called it. Participants made themselves familiar with the target sentence. Then they heard a different sentence, which was semantically related with it in a way, and then responded by producing their target sentence. Well, what we did is we manipulated the speech rate of the model speaker between 2.9 and 4.0 in 12 steps. This may sound a very slow speech, but we adapted it to the cerebellar patients who are known to have a reduced speaking rate. And we presented these stimuli in a randomized way with 2 subsequent sentences never differing by more than 0.3 syllables per second. We did this to avoid that the participants became aware of the manipulation of speaking rate. And the question here was, would participants reproduce the changes in the model speaker speaking rate in repetition and in turn-taking? And here is the sentence repetition condition. We see on the x-axis the model speaker's variation from 2.9 to 4.0 syllables per second. And here is the articulation rate of the participants. The Parkinson's patients had the fastest speaking rates, and the ataxic patients, the slower speaking rates. And we see that these 2 groups here, the Parkinson's and the controls, adapted rather closely to the model speaker. The correlation was rather high, and there was very little adaptation or no adaptation in the cerebellar ataxic patients. And this is the full model and the statistical analysis. What you see here is the regression coefficients, that is the model coefficients of a regression, mixed regression model of articulation rate of the participants versus the model speaker's rate. And the outcome was that the controls and the Parkinson's patients were had the same degree of adaptation, and the adaptation was much weaker in the ataxic patients. What we also see is there was less adaptation in the turn taking as compared to the repetition condition. And when we only look at the two patient groups, Parkinson's and cerebral ataxics, we see that the adaptation was even stronger in the irregular as compared to the regular sentences. And looking at individuals here across the pooled across the four conditions, that is 96 stimuli per participant, we see that 81% of the controls had significant adaptation to the model speakers rate, 80% in the Parkinson's group, and only 2 out of 12, that is 17%, in the cerebral ataxic group. So the answer is there was strong adaptation in neurotypical speakers and in patients with Parkinson's, and there was weak or no adaptation in patients with spinocerebellar ataxia. The adaptation was stronger in sentence repetition than in turn taking, and in the two patient group, we saw that the irregular rhythm was obviously a stronger attractor for rate adaptation than the regular rhythm. We had a second research question here, namely, would participants also adapt to the natural variation of the model speaker speech rhythm? So not the variation between the two types of rhythm, but the variation within the 24 sentences of each of these two types of rhythm. So what we did here, we marked the P centers of each syllable, that is the beats or the speech rhythm for the model speaker and the participants. And we compared the pairs of sentences for the timing of these beats. And we compared the vector of 9 interbeats interval here, the intervals between these beats, and looked at the Euclidean distance between these patterns as a measure of the rhythmical similarity of two sentences. And we had 3 conditions. We had the 3 conditions that I already mentioned. And in the read condition, this Euclidean distance describes a speaker's dissimilarity to the model speaker in the absence of any auditory input. Whereas in the repetition and turn condition, this parameter describes a speaker's similarity to the model speaker in each of these 2 conditions. And when we subtract these parameters, then we get a parameter that describes the degree of adaptation to the model speaker's speech rhythm. And this is the data. Again, we did a linear mixed model here, and what you see here is the relative convergence of rhythm in terms of this difference between repetition and reading, or turn taking and reading, in the 3 groups. And again, we see the Parkinson's at the top here. They adapt much more than the cerebellar patients, and also more than the controls. And we also see again the advantage of the repetition paradigm as compared to the turn-taking paradigm, which we had expected already. And looking at individual participants who adapted, we see here that only about half of the control participants showed adaptation to the model speaker's rhythm, whereas 80% of the Parkinson's patients adapted, and only 17% of the ataxic patients showed adaptation in this paradigm. So the answer is there was strong rhythm adaptation in Parkinson's disease, and weaker, though not significantly weaker, rhythm adaptation in the normal speakers, and weak or even no rhythm adaptation in patients with ataxic disorders. And adaptation was stronger in repetition than in the turn-taking. So the summary here is patients with striatal dysfunctions in Parkinson's disease demonstrate a preserved or even enhanced responsiveness to other speech rate and speech rhythm in interactive speech. And patients with cerebral dysfunction in spinocerebellar ataxia demonstrate a diminished or even absent responsiveness to other speech rate and rhythm. And there is no clear advantage of regular speech rhythm in promoting convergence of speech rates. Patients with striatal or cerebral dysfunctions may even be more attracted by the irregular rhythm. So the summary and the hypothesis one may derive from these lesion studies is that the right cerebral hemisphere is not critically involved in phonetic adaptation. Left anterior language cortex is not critically involved in phonetic adaptation. However, when it comes to temporal alignment, their speech planning and initiation impairment of patients who have lesions there contribute to disorders of temporal alignment here. And this is in line with a study by Castellucci that I have presented before, showing that this region, which is responsible for apraxia of speech, is also responsible for the timing in the temporal alignment in interactive conditions. Left posterior language cortex has a leading role in phonetic adaptation and temporal alignment to other speech, and the basal ganglia are not critically involved in adaptation, and a dysfunction in Parkinson's disease leads to even increased responsiveness to external stimuli. This is something that has already been observed in other motor modalities, responsiveness to metronome stimuli. And finally, the cerebellum is crucially involved in adaptation to other speech rate and rhythm, which is also compatible with what we know from other motor domains. So, clinical implications. Natural auditory speech input in an interactive context may have an implicit potential to, or has an implicit potential to modulate articulation, prosody, speech rate, and rhythm in patients with apraxia of speech, and also in Parkinson's dysarthria. And this may motivate us to construct interventions based on a systematic use of interactive language, which is more naturalistic than intervention based on metronome stimuli or on synchronous speech aids, and may therefore have a greater potential for transfer. But admittedly, perhaps they would have a weaker immediate effect. So this is my end. Thanks to the persons I have already mentioned who were implicated in all this work, and the collaborators who were involved, Annette Baumgärtner, Sebastian Baumann, Simone Falk, Georg Goldenberg, and Dagmar Timmann-Braun. Thanks also to the EKN group, and thanks also to our host department, the Institute of Phonetics in Munich. These are people who do very very good research on sound change and have inspired our work a lot. And they provide us a very open and inspiring atmosphere at this institute. Thank you.
So much, Wolfram. That was a great talk. A lot of food for thought. We have questions coming in. They're trickling in, not only from me, but also from Haris Themistokleous. Thank you so much. This is a fantastic talk, he says. My question is, to what extent entrainment in terms of sentence prosody, for example, or pitch accents, tonal resetting, sentence planning, can account for differences between patients with phonological impairment and apraxia of speech? How does sentence level tonal prosody compare to the metrical rhythmic entrainment as a predictor of pathology?
Okay, this is a complex, very good question, important question. Actually, we did not look at this experimentally, but it is true that this may be a lever to study the influences of for instance, syntactic and also other prosodic factors on the speech of patients with aphasia, with phonology impairment, or even apraxia of speech. We haven't done this before, but this would be a good idea to try out and do. And the stimuli we may get from these approaches, the proposed approaches, may be even even stronger, and even more helpful, perhaps, than our very natural and unmodulated stimuli that we used here.
I was wondering, when you were talking about study 2, at some point you were collapsing the speakers with apraxia of speech and the aphasic speakers who do not have apraxia of speech, because they had similar behavioral responses to that adaptation, or they adapted similarly or not. I was wondering, though, if it isn't still possible that the apraxia of speech and the other aphasic patients who did not temporarily align in study 2 perhaps did so for different reasons. So, for example, in the aphasic patients may be related to those lesions involving auditory cortex, Heschel's gyrus, that you pointed out in study 1, but in the speakers with apraxia of speech, simply because of their reduced control over their speech initiation and articulation. Those would be two very different reasons for not to adapt, right?
Yes, this is definitely the case. So the point is that obviously the temporal alignment paradigm yields different results from the adaptation paradigms, and the timing of speech in aphasic speakers is a really crucial aspect in these paradigms, and patients with phonology impairment may differ in their timing for other reasons than apraxic speakers do. You are right on this point. So I collapsed these two to make it shorter, but we definitely know that there must be different reasons for this.
We have a question from Tiffany Biro or Biro. I have to apologize, I'm not sure. The phonological errors observed in logopenic primary progressive aphasia have been posited to arise due to neurodegeneration of phonological short-term memory within left inferior parietal regions. Do you see any evidence of the temporoparietal junction or left inferior parietal regions being involved with the convergence patterns you observed in study 1?
Yes, indeed, I did. We did. So I mentioned that we had a couple of a series of papers on this project, and there were two fMRI papers by Claudia Peschke on exactly this issue, and where she found activation in the SPT region, exactly the region the colleague has mentioned, which was crucial for adaptation in the two paradigms that I presented here.
I was also wondering if you expect an individual patient's level of adaptation, which you might call their adaptive ability maybe, to be a predictor of fluency recovery or response to treatment. So to what extent does the adaptive ability predict their?
I would predict that it is a predictor, of course, and this should be tried out by therapists. And we see very often in a apraxic patient that they really are keen to see the therapist's mouth and to follow up the auditory stimuli presented by a therapist. So some of these patients are really responsive to auditory stimulation, and they may, the persons also who profit more from this kind of therapeutic approach.
Then we have a couple of thank yous. Harris says thank you for your answer. Tiffany says thank you, and Mick McNeil says thank you very much for an excellent presentation and your careful programmatic research.